Western media does deny the acts of the terrorists in Syria. There are many instances in which they blame the acts of terrorists on the Syrian army themselves, and these have been debunked, like the Ghouta attacks, like the Khan al-Assal attacks, and many massacres. In fact, the terrorists even of the Free Syrian Army committed, and Western media largely ignored them. On a personal level, for example, in April 2014, there was a mortar, at least one mortar, which struck a school in Old Damascus. The school is called Al-Manar, and if I recall, one child was killed and over 60 were injured. And I went to a hospital called the French Hospital with some others on this peace delegation I was in Syria with, and we wanted to see, who were the injured children, to document them, to try to share their stories, or at least share the fact that a school had been shelled by a militant in Jobar, or east of Damascus. And while there, we ran into Lise Doucet of the BBC, and she saw the same children. She could have asked the questions and deduced that the mortar indeed came from a militant area, but her later report said something to the effect of, we don't know where it came from. That's one instance. In November of last year, I was in Aleppo on my third of 4 visits to Aleppo, and on November 3rd, there was a rain of Grad missiles and gas canister bombs and explosive bullets and mortars onto civilian areas of Aleppo. By the end of the day, 18 people had been killed and over 200 had been injured. And the journalists that I was with from New York Times, BBC, and other venues or other sites, we were at the Razi Hospital, which is one of the main hospitals in Aleppo, and we saw some of the injured coming into the hospital, and we saw some of the corpses of those killed in these attacks come into the morgue around the corner from the hospital. And in the piece the New York Times journalist later wrote, I don't remember verbatim what she said, but she was implying that this kind of attacks was unusual, where we'd been told, and anybody who researches a little bit on Aleppo would know, we'd been told that on a daily basis, or near daily basis, the people of Aleppo were being attacked by mortars, gas canister bombs, etc. But in her report, she couldn't simply state what she'd seen. She had to imply that this was somewhat unusual, and she had to qualify it with an unsubstantiated report by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in the UK, and their allegation that some sort of attack had occurred by Syria or Russia the same day. So it is a theme that the Western media will in chorus accuse the Syrian army and the government of massacres, of crimes against humanity, they're both distorting the reality and ignoring the truth on the ground, which is that the civilians of Syria have been suffering for years since this Western instigated so-called revolution started in 2011. And Western media that reports on civilian deaths do occur when the army is fighting terrorists. It's a war. Civilian deaths will occur. But what the media ignores is the context. It ignores who has funded these terrorists. It ignores the fact that Turkey and Israel have been attacking Syria, and that this whole situation wouldn't have occurred if the West, primarily Washington and its allies, hadn't manufactured, this notion of a revolution, hadn't sent arms to the so-called rebels, hadn't distorted the reality on the ground, hadn't funded the so-called opposition, and through, over the years in Syria, the West has continued to fund rebels, or so-called rebels, and they've continued to whitewash the crimes of the so-called rebels. I mean, when a group the West calls moderates is able to decapitate a Palestinian boy, Abdullah Isa, and get away with it and still be called moderates, all the West has done is to say, well, this was a mistake, this was a one-off. The media continues to put forth this notion that the Free Syrian Army, for example, are moderates, or Nuruddin al-Zinki are moderates, or Ahrar al-Sham are not as bad as al-Nusra. But from the very beginning, before any of these militant factions formed, in the so-called nonviolent protests, there were heinous acts which occurred. And in areas like, for example, there was an area where a farmer from Banyas was massacred by a mob of so-called unarmed protesters. He was massacred and mutilated, his face was mutilated, and he was murdered. And this was at a time when the media was telling us that the only crimes occurring in Syria were at the hands of the Syrian government or the Syrian army. And in fact, it was the opposite. It was people amongst the protesters that had weapons that were firing on, in many cases, unarmed security forces. Over the years, the West has refused to really acknowledge the crimes of these different militant factions. For example, one thing I always try to highlight, because the media never talks about them, is the villages of Fu and Kafraya. And there are two villages in Idlib province, or Idlib governorate, which have been surrounded by militants, again of Ahrar al-Sham, al-Nusra, and other factions, who've been fully besieging them since March 2015. And even in years prior, they had been under partial siege. And these villages are suffering actual starvation, and they're actually suffering from want of medical care. And on top of that, they're being bombed on a daily basis and sniped on a daily basis by these terrorist factions that are encircling them. The West cries about, human rights and democracy and freedom and, helping the Syrian people. They completely negate the suffering of people in certain areas because it doesn't serve their agenda. And their agenda is to portray these different militant factions as rebels, as people that are bringing freedom and democracy. It's quite ironic that in eastern Aleppo, for example, the scenes we were seeing were women were being forced to wear dressed completely in black from head to toe, and people I interviewed that had managed to flee East Aleppo or eastern areas of Aleppo told me this. They said this is one of the first things these militants did, is they forced women to dress like this. And there was certainly no human rights for women there, let alone for people in general, because the militants were hoarding food and they were punishing people for not praying in the way of these militants. They were harnessing Islam and telling people that this is the way you have to practice your religion. This is the freedom that the West is bringing to Syria. Syria, a secular nation which has for a secular nation which has been proud of its secularity, and which was a developing nation, and which was one of the safest countries on earth prior to 2011, and where education is free, healthcare is free, and people don't define themselves by sectarian terms unless they happen to be of the Muslim Brotherhood persuasion, but the majority of people don't. I just want to add something about Western or corporate media reporting. I shouldn't say all Western journalists, and not all corporate media journalists either, but largely they've been reading from the same script. And we can see this in many campaigns, whether it was Madaya, where they were suddenly screaming starvation, and when in fact journalists went into the area, they found out why there was some starvation. It was because the militants inside were controlling all the food stores there. Or whether the media chorus is screaming last hospital in Aleppo, last doctor in Aleppo. There have been many occasions in which most of the corporate media have been saying the same thing at the same time, suddenly out of nowhere. But tonight, for example, there was a panel in which I spoke, in which Professor Chossudovsky spoke and Eve Engler spoke about various aspects of this premeditated war on Syria. And I gave a number of on-the-ground anecdotes and showed photos and videos from particularly Aleppo, since that was a topic that the media was so concerned about. There were journalists from Radio Canada and La Presse, and prior I had decided that I wasn't going to talk with them because, in my opinion, after a certain speech I gave in a panel at the UN, went a bit viral. There have been journalists who've been wanting to just simply run smear campaigns because of things I said, and the things I was saying had to do with the fact that corporate media is lying on Syria and many other issues. So I had decided I wasn't going to talk to these journalists because, frankly, it's a waste of my time. They just want their soundbite, and then they can go and spin their story. However, somebody asked me to please speak with these journalists. From the tone of their voice, I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect they're going to produce something that it doesn't reflect what I was saying about what I saw in Aleppo, what Syrians were saying to me. It doesn't reflect the will of Syrians or the reality that Syrians have been enduring. I suspect it's going to be a hit piece that tries to discredit me in some way for something I've said. And this is a notable point. I'm not perfect, and I might articulate something incorrectly or not say something as well as I could have said. But I am trying to tell the truth and trying to share the testimonies I've gathered. The media never is held accountable when they outright lie. The BBC outright lies. The CBC outright lies. They're never held accountable. And this is another reason I was going to boycott them, and I am from now on boycotting them, because they have control over the narrative, and I really think we need to be supporting, the independent media more and ignore the corporate media or call them out on their lies, but certainly not cater to them. We can't expect them to suddenly have an agenda of telling truth on Syria or any other issue.
The Center for Research on Globalization depends on your support. To purchase a book or DVD, or to make a donation, please visit globalresearch.ca today.